The thrift store on Monroe Avenue is quietest on Tuesday mornings, which is exactly why I went on Tuesday mornings. Rain on the windows, the smell of other people's lives hanging in the air, old wool and mothballs, and the faint, stale sweetness of somebody's perfume from a decade ago. Fluorescent light on racks that went on forever. I was not looking for anything in particular that morning. That was the whole trouble with my life by then, if I am honest. I was rarely looking for anything in particular anymore. I was just a woman moving her hands slowly along a rack of second-hand coats, giving them something to do, somewhere to be, on a weekday I had no other use for. And then my fingers found the good one. Heavy charcoal gray wool, beautifully made, my size, $8 on the tag. I bought it. And that night, when I tried it on again at home in my empty kitchen, I felt something folded deep down in the inside pocket. I almost did not buy it even. I stood there in the store holding it, doing the small, joyless math I did about everything then. Do I need it? No. Do I have a coat? Yes. Put it back. The old me, the me from before, bought things because they were beautiful and life was for living. The widow me bought nothing without an argument. But the wool was so good, and $8 is $8, and some small, stubborn part of me that had not entirely switched off said, "Just this once, take the nice thing." I have thought about that small, stubborn part a great deal since. If it had lost the argument that morning, if I had put the coat back on the rack, as I nearly did, Vivian's letter would still be writing from thrift store to thrift store, or in a landfill, and Susan would still be lying awake, wondering if her mother died hating her. The whole rescue turned on a 50-year-old widow deciding, against her own grayness, to let herself have one nice thing. It was a letter, several pages, folded small, written by hand in blue ink by a woman I had never met, and it was not meant for me at all. It was a mother's letter to her daughter, and the daughter had never received it. I want to tell you what that letter said, and what I did about it, and what it did to me. Because that $8 coat changed the worst year of my life. My name is Denise Faulkner. I am 50 years old, and I work as a unit secretary at a hospital in Rochester, New York. I am the person at the desk on the floor, the one who keeps the charts moving and answers the call lights and is, by the nature of the job, almost completely invisible. I have thought a lot this past year about being invisible, because that is exactly what I had become, in my own life, before a stranger's letter found me. There is a particular invisibility that comes to women of a certain age, and it doubles when you are widowed and your children are grown. You stop being anyone's wife, and you stop being anyone's daily mother, and you are not yet anyone's frail elder needing care. And so you fall into a kind of gap where the world simply stops registering you. Waiters look past you. Younger people finish your sentences. At work, I was the reliable desk that the floor ran on, and not one doctor in that hospital could have told you a single thing about my life. I am not complaining exactly. It is just the truth of where I was. I had become a useful, pleasant, completely interchangeable absence. And the strangest part is how easy it is to start agreeing with the world's assessment, to look in the mirror and think, yes, that's right, there's no one important here anymore. I am going to tell you about the letter. But first, you have to understand the year I was having and the woman who had stopped looking for anything in particular. My husband Greg died a year and a half before that Tuesday. It was not sudden. There was an illness and a long, hard slope down, and then he was gone, and I was 50 years old and alone in a house built for a family that no longer lived in it. Our kids were grown and gone by then, scattered to their own cities and their own lives, calling on Sundays, loving me from a distance the way grown children do. Greg had been the center of my days for 26 years, and when he went, the days did not just lose their center, they lost their point. I kept going to work because the hospital did not stop needing someone at the desk. I kept the house, sort of. I ate standing up. And mostly, I moved through a life that had become a series of motions with nothing holding them together. A widow rattling around in too much space, feeling about as seen and as necessary as the furniture. I was not in crisis, exactly. I was just slowly disappearing, the way people do when no one needs them for anything. And I had started to believe that this gray, pointless, invisible drift was simply what the rest of my life was going to be. That was the woman who bought the coat. That is who the letter found. People kept telling me that year that grief takes time, that I had to be patient with myself, and they were right, and I was patient. But there is a difference between grieving and disappearing, and somewhere in the second year, I had slid quietly from the first into the second without noticing a line. Grief is active. It is love with nowhere to go, and it aches because it is alive. What I had become was something flatter than grief, a kind of low-grade absence from my own life, where I was not so much sad anymore as simply switched off, waiting out my days. I did not have language for the difference at the time. I only knew that I felt like a ghost in my own house, haunting rooms I used to live in. It would take a dead stranger's letter to switch the lights back on. I want to be honest about how small my world had gotten, because it matters for what came after. I had stopped cooking real meals. There seemed no point cooking for one. I had let friendships thin out, because grief makes you tiring company, and eventually people stop pushing. The phone calls from my kids, which I lived for, also quietly shamed me, because I could hear them worrying about me, and I had nothing to report except that I was fine. Fine! Everything was fine. The word you use when there is simply nothing happening in your life at all. Weekends were the worst. Greg and I used to fill them. Now they were just 2 empty days to be gotten through until work gave me somewhere to be again. The thrift store, honestly, was part of that. A way to put a destination on a Saturday so that I had left the house, so that I could tell my daughter I had gone somewhere. That is how hollow it had gotten. I was manufacturing small errands to prove to myself I was still a person who did things. I almost did not even read it. When my fingers first closed on that folded paper in the pocket, my first thought was that I should just throw it away, somebody's old shopping list, some scrap left behind. But it was thick, several pages, and folded with a kind of care that made me pause. So I sat down at my kitchen table, under the light, and I unfolded a stranger's letter. It opened with a date from only a few months earlier, and the words, "My dear Susan." And it took me only a paragraph to understand what I was holding. This was not a casual note. This was a woman who knew she was dying, writing to her daughter, a letter of the most personal and final kind, the kind you write when you have run out of time, and there are things that simply cannot go unsaid. I knew, reading the first page, that I should probably stop, that this was nobody's business but theirs. But I also understood, by the bottom of that first page, something that changed everything. This letter had never been delivered. It was here, in a coat, in a thrift store, in my kitchen, which meant the daughter it was written to had never read it. A dying mother had poured out her heart to her child, and then the words had ended up in a donation bag instead of in her daughter's hands. I have wondered since how it happened, how a letter that important ends up forgotten in a coat. But I think I know, because I have cleared out the home of someone I loved. When Greg died, I packed his things in a fog, half blind with grief, and I am certain I missed pockets, missed slips of paper, missed who knows what. Whoever cleared Vivian's home, perhaps a relative, perhaps Susan herself, too overwhelmed to check every coat, was almost certainly moving through that same fog. You do not think, in that state, to go through the pockets of a wool coat headed for the donation pile. You are just trying to survive the unbearable task of dismantling a life. So the letter rode out of the house in a pocket, into a bag, onto a truck, onto a rack on Monroe Avenue, and waited there for me. It was nobody's failure. It was just grief, doing what grief does, missing things. Which is exactly why it needed a stranger, clear-eyed and unburdened, to find what the grieving had walked right past. And so I kept reading, because by then I had to know whether this was a story that had ended or one I could still do something about. There was a line near the top of that first page that hooked into me and would not let go. Vivian had written, "I keep starting this letter and not finishing it, because finishing it means admitting how little time I have left to fix what I broke." I read that sentence 3 times. Here was a woman who had clearly written and rewritten and put off and tried again. A woman fighting her own pride and fear right there on the page, racing a clock she knew she was losing to. And she had, in the end, finished it. The letter was complete, signed, folded. She had won that fight with herself. She had said everything. She had done the brave, hard, final thing. And then, by some ordinary catastrophe of a forgotten pocket in a donation bag, the finished letter had never traveled the last few feet into her daughter's hands. The tragedy was not that Vivian failed to say it. The tragedy was that she succeeded, and it still didn't arrive. That was the thing I could not walk away from. The letter was from a woman named Vivian, and it was, from beginning to end, the letter of a mother trying to repair something before she ran out of time. I will not repeat all of it. It was achingly private. But I can tell you its shape, because its shape is the whole heart of this story. Vivian and her daughter Susan had been estranged, or nearly so, for years. There had been some long-ago rupture, the kind of thing that starts as one real hurt and then calcifies over years into a distance neither person knows how to cross. They had not spoken much in a long time, and Vivian, knowing she was dying, had sat down to write the things she had been too proud, or too stubborn, or too afraid to say while there was still ordinary time to say them. She wrote that the estrangement had been as much her fault as Susan's, more even. She wrote that she had been wrong about the thing they fell out over, and that her pride had cost them both years they could never get back. She wrote over and over in different words that she loved her daughter completely and had never once stopped through all the silence. And she wrote that she was sorry, a long, specific, unguarded apology from a mother to a daughter, the kind most people never manage to say out loud in their whole lives. It was, I realized, everything Susan would ever need to hear, and Susan had never gotten to hear it. What struck me hardest reading it was how ordinary the original rupture had been. Vivian described it a little in the letter, and it was not some unforgivable betrayal, not abuse, not a crime. It was the usual heartbreaking human stuff, a disagreement about a choice Susan had made years ago, words said in anger that should have been taken back within the week, and then both of them too proud to be the first to call, and the silence hardening month by month into a wall that came to feel permanent and even normal. That is what undid me. Whole years, a mother and daughter who loved each other, lost not to some great evil, but to ordinary pride and the simple failure to pick up a phone. I sat in my kitchen thinking of every silence in my own life that I had let calcify the same way, every person I had stopped calling for no reason I could even properly remember anymore. Vivian's letter was about Susan, but it was also, suddenly, about me, and about everyone who has ever let a fixable distance turn into a permanent one simply by waiting too long to be the brave one. I sat at my kitchen table and I cried over a letter written by a woman I had never met, to a daughter I had never met, because I understood exactly what I was holding. I was holding a reconciliation that had not happened. A mother had done the hardest thing a person can do, humbled herself, apologized, reached across years of silence, and then the bridge she built had simply never reached the other side. And now Vivian, whoever she had been, was almost certainly gone. But Susan was, presumably, still out there somewhere, still carrying whatever grief and anger and unfinished business a person carries when a parent they were estranged from dies before anything got fixed. And the words that could heal all of it were sitting in my hands. So I had a decision to make. I want to tell you about that decision because it was the first decision in a year and a half that had felt like it actually mattered. The easy thing would have been to do nothing. I could have thrown the letter away and told myself it was none of my business. I could have kept it, this stranger's beautiful, sad letter, as a curiosity. Both of those would have been simpler, and no one would ever have known. But sitting there, I found I could not do either, and the reason surprised me. For a year and a half, I had felt useless, a woman nothing depended on, whose presence or absence changed nothing for anyone. And here, suddenly, was a thing that depended entirely on me. There was a woman out there who needed to hear that her dying mother loved her and was sorry, and as far as I could tell, I was the only living person who knew that those words existed. The most invisible woman in Rochester was holding something that mattered enormously to a stranger, and I could either be the bridge or be the place the letter died. I remember the exact moment the decision crystallized. I was holding the pages and I thought, with a clarity I had not felt in 18 months, if I do nothing, this love dies here, in my kitchen, with me. Vivian fought her whole pride to write it. Susan is somewhere out there aching for exactly these words, and the only thing standing between that mother's last love and that daughter's broken heart is whether I, Denise Faulkner, can be bothered to act. Put that way, it was not really a decision at all. There are moments when the universe quietly hands you a job that is unmistakably yours, and the only question is whether you will pretend you didn't notice. I noticed. I decided, at that kitchen table, that I was going to find Susan. I had no idea how, but for the first time since Greg died, I had something I needed to do. Finding Susan turned out to be a small detective story, and I threw myself into it with an energy I had not felt in a very long time. I started with the coat. I went back to the thrift store and asked, gently, whether they could tell me anything about where a particular donation had come from. I explained, carefully, that I had found something important in a pocket and was trying to return it to the family. The manager was kind, but the records were thin. Donations come in bags, mostly anonymous. But there was a date, and there was a first name in the letter, Vivian, and there were a few specific details in the letter itself. A mention of a street, a reference to the church Vivian had belonged to. I am a unit secretary. Finding people in a haystack of partial information is, in a strange way, exactly the muscle my job has built. I made calls. I checked obituaries from the previous few months, and there she was. Vivian. The dates lined up. The obituary mentioned a daughter, Susan, and the city she lived in. It also confirmed the thing I had feared and expected. Vivian had passed away a few months earlier, and her belongings, it seemed, had been donated by someone clearing out her home. Coat, an unsent letter and all. The letter forgotten in a pocket no one thought to check. I had found my dead stranger. Now I had to find her living daughter and figure out how on earth you tell someone what I had to tell her. I read Vivian's obituary several times, the way you study the face of someone you are about to meet. It was short, as obituaries often are, a life compressed into a paragraph. Survived by, predeceased by, services were held. And it told me almost nothing about the woman whose handwriting I now knew better than that of some people in my own family. But reading between its careful lines, I could see the shape of the same story the letter told. A daughter listed, but listed in a way that felt distant, and no mention of the closeness you sometimes see spelled out when a family was whole. It was the obituary of a woman who had died with unfinished business, written by people who perhaps did not know how much. And somewhere in the city named in it was Susan, going about the strange, flat aftermath of a complicated mother's death, with no idea that her mother's last and truest words were sitting in a thrift store coat across town, in the kitchen of a widow she had never met. It took me another week to track down a way to reach Susan, and another few days after that to work up the nerve to do it. Because how do you make that contact? There is no etiquette for it. "Hello, you don't know me. I bought your dead mother's coat and I have her last letter to you," is not a sentence anyone is prepared to receive. In the end, I wrote to her first, carefully rather than calling. I thought she should be able to absorb the shock in private. I drafted that message more times than I have drafted almost anything in my life. Too short, and it sounded like a scam. Too long, and it sounded unhinged. Too much detail about the letter felt like a violation. Too little, and she might dismiss it. I kept imagining it landing in her life, this stranger, out of nowhere, reaching into the rawest wound she had, the death of a mother she had not made peace with. I did not want to be one more pain delivered to a grieving woman. I wanted to be a mercy, and I was terrified of getting the difference wrong. In the end, I decided the kindest thing was to be plain and gentle and to give her all the control. Here is who I am. Here is what I have. It is yours whenever and however you want it, and if you want nothing to do with it, I understand. I sent it, and then I genuinely could not eat for a day, waiting, feeling the enormous weight of holding a piece of someone's heart in my hands and trying not to drop it. I told her who I was, and that I had come into possession of a coat that I believed had belonged to her late mother Vivian, and that inside it I had found a letter, handwritten, addressed to her, that appeared never to have been delivered. I told her I was so sorry for her loss, and that I had not read more of the letter than I needed to in order to understand who it belonged to. A small lie of kindness. I had read all of it, but she did not need that. And I told her that if she wanted it, I would bring it to her myself, or mail it, or do whatever was easiest for her. Then I sent it, and I waited, and I did not know if I had just performed an act of kindness or detonated something in the life of a woman who had finally made her peace with a silence I was about to break wide open. Susan called me the next morning, and her voice was shaking, and we arranged to meet that weekend at a coffee shop halfway between our two lives. I brought the coat, cleaned and pressed, with the letter inside the pocket exactly where I had found it, because some instinct told me she should be the one to take it out. Susan was about my age, 50 or so, with her mother's handwriting careful way about her, I would later think. She was nervous and guarded when she sat down, and I understood why. A stranger with a dead mother's letter is a frightening thing, so I just slid the coat across the table to her and told her simply that her mother had written her something, and that it had been waiting in this pocket, and that I thought she should have it. And I watched this woman I had never met reach into the pocket of her dead mother's coat and pull out a letter she did not know existed, and unfold it, and begin to read her mother's handwriting. And I watched her face do the thing I will never forget as long as I live. The thing a person's face does when they receive, against all hope, the exact thing they had given up ever getting. There is no sound quite like the one a person makes reading something they had given up on. It was not loud. It was a kind of breaking open, a sound somewhere between a sob and a gasp, the sound of a held breath, years finally being let go. Her hand went to her mouth. She read the first lines, and then she had to stop and just press the pages to her chest for a moment with her eyes shut, the way you hold something you cannot believe is real, before she could make herself go on. I sat very still across the table and did not say a word, because there are moments that belong entirely to one person, and you are only there to witness them, to make sure they are not alone for it. I had carried this the last mile so that she would not be alone when it arrived. So I stayed, and I let her have her mother back across that little coffee shop table, one blue ink line at a time. She read it twice at that table, crying the whole way through, and then she told me her side, and her side broke my heart and mended it at the same time. Susan had spent the last few months in a particular kind of hell, the hell of a child whose estranged parent dies before anything gets resolved. Her mother had passed, and Susan had been left holding a lifetime of unfinished business with no way to ever finish it. All the anger she had never worked through, but also, underneath it, all the love and longing she had buried under the anger, and the unbearable knowledge that now it was too late, that her mother had died still believing, as far as Susan knew, that the distance between them was permanent and mutual. Susan had been tormented by the not knowing. Had her mother been sorry? Had her mother still loved her at the end? Or had she died angry? Susan would never know. Except now, because of a coat in a thrift store and a stranger, she did know. She held in her hands the proof that her mother had spent some of her last strength reaching for her, apologizing to her, loving her. The letter answered every single question that had been tormenting her. Her mother had been sorry. Her mother had loved her to the very end, and the reconciliation that death had seemed to make impossible had, in fact, happened. Vivian had made it happen, on paper, with the last of her time. It had just needed someone to carry it the final distance. Susan told me something else at that table that I have held on to. She said that in the months since her mother died, she had been unable to stop torturing herself with one question above all the others. Had her mother known she was loved? Because Susan, for all the anger and all the silence, had never stopped loving her mother either. She had just lost the road back, exactly as Vivian had, and she had been terrified that Vivian had died believing her daughter hated her. The letter answered that too, in a way I had not even fully registered when I read it. Vivian wrote that she knew, underneath everything, that Susan still loved her, and that she was at peace about it. So, the letter did not only give Susan her mother's love, it gave Susan the relief of knowing her mother had felt hers. Both directions of a love that had gone unspoken for years got delivered in one afternoon by one letter that very nearly never arrived. Two women had spent years each believing the other had stopped caring, and both of them had been wrong, and the proof had been sitting in a pocket the whole time. I want to tell you what that morning in the coffee shop did for me, because this is really the part of the story I most need you to hear. I had come to that meeting a useless, invisible, drifting widow, a woman nothing depended on, and I sat across from Susan and watched a year and a half of my own grayness simply lift because I understood that I had just done something that mattered more than almost anything I had done in years. I had not been able to fix my own loss. I could not bring Greg back. I could not give myself back the point my life had lost. But I had been able to carry a dying woman's love across a city and put it into the hands of the daughter who needed it. And in doing that, I had repaired something that no one else on earth could have repaired, because no one else on earth knew it was broken. The most invisible woman in Rochester had turned out to be the one indispensable link in a chain of love between two people she had never met. And I realized, sitting there, that I had been wrong about my whole year. I had thought that because nothing needed me, I was good for nothing. But the truth was that I had simply not yet found the thing that needed me. Purpose, it turned out, was not gone. It had just been waiting in a pocket. I thought about Greg, sitting there. I thought about how, in the long months of his illness, I had been so completely needed. Every day, every hour, 100 small, indispensable tasks that only I could do for him, and how, when he died, all of that need had vanished overnight, and I had mistaken the loss of being needed by him for the loss of being needed at all. I had folded up my whole capacity to matter and put it away with his things, because the one person who had needed me most was gone. And what Susan's face across that table showed me was that the capacity had never gone anywhere. I was still a person who could matter enormously to someone. I had just been looking for that someone only in the empty space where Greg used to be, instead of out in the wide world, where the needs are endless, and where a stranger's mother had just proven that I was very much still good for something. The need had not died with my husband. I had only stopped looking for it anywhere but the one place it could no longer be found. A year has passed now since the coffee shop. Susan and I stayed in touch. Not constantly, but really. There is a particular bond between two women who met across a dead woman's letter, and it did not dissolve once the letter was delivered. She tells me, sometimes, what it has meant to her to have those words. She keeps the letter framed, she says, the way I keep certain things of Greg's. We are an unlikely pair of friends, brought together by $8 of wool and a pocket no one checked. She sent me a photograph, a few months in, of the letter framed on her wall, beside a picture of her mother, and beside those, a little surprisingly, a thank you card I had once sent her, which she said she had kept because, she wrote, I was now a part of the story too, the stranger who brought her mother home. That undid me a little, to be honest. For a year and a half I had not felt like part of anyone's story, and here was a woman framing me on her wall as a character in the most important thing that had happened to her family. We do not see each other often. We live 2 cities apart and we have our own lives, but a few times a year, around the hard dates, her mother's birthday and the anniversary, Susan calls me and we talk. 2 women who would never have met but for a coat, keeping a small flame lit for a woman only one of us ever knew. But the deeper thing the letter changed was in me, and it outlasted that one good deed. Because once I understood that I could be useful, that an invisible woman at a desk could be the bridge a whole family needed, I started looking for it. I started, of all things, volunteering at the hospital beyond my job, sitting with patients who have no one, the invisible ones, the ones nobody comes for. There is a name for it, in some hospitals, a No One Should Die Alone program. Volunteers who sit with patients in their final hours when there is no family, or no family who will come. I had walked past those rooms for years as the woman at the desk, and never once thought it could be me in the chair beside the bed. Now, I sit in those chairs. I hold hands that have no one else to hold them. I am present for strangers at the most enormous moment of their lives, the same way I was present for Susan at hers, the same way no one was present for Vivian's letter until I checked a pocket. It is the most meaningful thing I have ever done, and I would never have found it if a dead woman's coat had not first shown me that an invisible person can be the one who matters most in a room. I am good at it, it turns out. I know how to be a quiet presence that matters, and I think often, doing it, of Vivian, a woman I never met, whose forgotten letter reached into the worst year of my life and reminded me that being unseen is not the same as being unnecessary. I still have the thought sometimes, late, that the whole thing turned on the thinnest thread of chance. If I had not gone to that store on that Tuesday, if I had bought a different coat, if I had thrown the letter away, as I almost did, Susan would have gone the rest of her life never knowing her mother was sorry, never knowing she was loved to the end, and I would have gone the rest of mine believing I was good for nothing. Two women, a stranger to each other, both saved by the same forgotten letter, because one of us happened to check a pocket. I do not know what to call that except a kind of grace, but I have stopped believing my life lost its point when Greg died. The point was just waiting for me to find the thing that needed carrying. I want to leave you with the two things this taught me. The first is for anyone who feels invisible, anyone who has reached a stretch of life where it seems like nothing depends on you, where you have started to drift and disappear because no one seems to need what you have to give. I felt exactly that for a year and a half, and I was completely wrong, and it took a stranger's letter to show me how wrong. Being unneeded is almost never a permanent fact about you. It is just a gap between you and the thing that has not found you yet. The world is absolutely full of small, invisible, enormous needs. A letter that needs carrying, a lonely person who needs sitting with, a bridge that needs someone to be it, and the people who feel most useless are very often exactly the ones with the time and the heart to meet those needs, if they will just keep their eyes open. You are not good for nothing. You have simply not yet checked the right pocket. The second thing is about love left unsaid, and it is gentler. Vivian almost died with everything important unsaid, and then she didn't because she wrote it down, even though she never managed to deliver it. And here is what I have come to believe from carrying her words. Love that gets put into the world does not just evaporate when it fails to reach its target on the first try. It waits. It finds another route. Sometimes it sits in a coat pocket for months and then travels through a stranger's hands to arrive exactly where it was always meant to go. So say the thing, write the letter, make the apology, reach across the silence, put the love into words even if you are not sure it will land, because you do not always get to control how or when it arrives. But love committed to the world has a way of finding its way home. It just sometimes needs a stranger to carry it the last mile. If this story landed for you, drop the word pocket in the comments below. I read them. It tells me which stories are worth telling next. Subscribe for new stories, real patterns, full narratives, the long game. Two small pieces of wisdom from this one before I go. First, feeling invisible is not the same as being unnecessary. If you have reached a stretch where it seems like nothing depends on you, where you have started to quietly disappear because no one seems to need what you have to give, I have been exactly there, and I was completely wrong about what it meant. Being unneeded is almost never a permanent truth about you. It is just a gap between you and the need that has not found you yet. The world is full of small, invisible, enormous needs waiting for someone with the time and the heart to meet them, and the people who feel most useless are often precisely the ones equipped to answer. You are not good for nothing. You have just not yet checked the right pocket. Second, love put into the world is not lost just because it doesn't arrive on the first try. Vivian nearly died with everything unsaid, and then she wrote it down, and even though she never delivered it, it still reached her daughter in the end, carried the last mile by a stranger. Love that gets committed to the world has a way of finding its route home, sometimes long after, sometimes through hands you never expected. So say the thing, write the letter, make the apology while there is still time, and even if you fear it won't land, you don't get to control exactly how or when it arrives. But love spoken into the world rarely disappears completely. Sometimes it just needs a stranger to carry it home. Love left unsaid is not always lost. Sometimes it just needs a stranger to carry it home. I'll see you next time.